Omega Prime Sports Services presents the NFL Week 1 Pick Recap. We will analyze team performances from games we selected against the spread. Our current week record is 2 covers and 3 fails, which makes our season-to-date record 2-3. We protected ourselves from major losses by only betting 1/4 of a unit. Our starting bankroll was $2,000. Our current bankroll is $1,975. We will also be tracking individual weeks for positive units and negative units. So far, we have had 0 positive weeks and 1 negative week. The Omega quarterback rating is based on a combination of the modern passer rating and incompletions. The Cowboys had an Omega quarterback rating of 14.46 for C- grade. The Eagles had an Omega quarterback rating of 32.58 for a B+ grade. The Eagles also had the higher yards per attempt. Teams with a higher YPA usually win. Next, we will examine how efficient and effective a team moves the ball with our stat inertia. The Cowboys had an inertia of 2.20 for a C+ grade. The Eagles had an inertia of 6.23 for an A grade. Now, it is time to examine intensity, drive factor, point factor, and time of possession factor. Intensity is how well a team scores compared to their inertia rating. Consider intensity to be how dynamic a team is. The Cowboys had an intensity of 1.06 for a C+ grade. The Eagles had an intensity of 1.62 for a B+ grade. Drive factor is how well a team scores per drive. The Cowboys had a drive factor of 1.66 for a D+ grade. The Eagles had a drive factor of 2.00 for a C+ grade. Point factor is how well a team scores for each 100 yards gained. The Cowboys had a point factor of 2.66 for a C grade. The Eagles had a point factor of 3.43 for a B grade. Time of possession factor is how well a team scores for each second that they have the ball. The Cowboys had a time of possession factor of 34.41 for a D+ grade. The Eagles had a time of possession factor of 57.29 for a B+ grade. The Chiefs had an Omega quarterback rating of 17.05 for a C+ grade. The Chargers had an Omega quarterback rating of 37.16 for an A grade. The Chargers also had a better YPA. The Chiefs had an inertia of 1.33 for a D grade. The Chargers had an inertia of 2.72 for a B- grade. The Chiefs had an intensity of 1.06 for C+ grade. The Chargers had an intensity of 1.47 for a B+ grade. The Chiefs had a drive factor of 1.75 for a C- grade. The Chargers had a drive factor of 2.25 for a B grade. The Chiefs had a point factor of 3.21 for a C+ grade. The Chargers had a point factor of 4.45 for a B+ grade. The Chiefs had a time of possession factor of 38.49 for a C- grade. The Chargers had a time of possession factor of 59.41 for a B+ grade. The Panthers had an Omega quarterback rating of 4.11 for a F grade. The Jags had an Omega quarterback rating of 12.75 for a D+ grade. The Jags also had the better YPA. The Panthers had an inertia rating of 1.39 for a D- grade. The Jags had an inertia rating of 2.87 for a B+ grade. The Panthers had an intensity of 0.51 for a F grade. The Jags had an intensity of 1.43 for a B- grade. The Panthers had a drive factor of 1.00 for a F grade. The Jags had a drive factor of 2.60 for a B+ grade. The Panthers had a point factor of 1.34 for a F grade. The Jags had a point factor of 4.18 for a B+ grade. The Panthers had a time of possession factor of 19.35 for a F grade. The Jags had a time of possession factor of 53.79 for a B+ grade. The Cards had an Omega quarterback rating of 18.12 for a C+ grade. The Saints had an Omega quarterback rating of 10.71 for a D grade. The Saints had the better YPA. Usually the team with the better YPA wins. The Cards had an inertia rating of 2.42 for a B grade. The Saints had an inertia rating of 1.40 for a D grade. The Cards had an intensity of 1.07 for a C+ grade. The Saints had an intensity of 0.66 for a D- grade. The Cards had a drive factor of 1.81 for a C- grade. The Saints had a drive factor of 1.30 for a D grade. The Cards had a points factor of 2.76 for a C- grade. The Saints had a point factor of 1.89 for a D+ grade. The Cards had a time of possession factor of 45.74 for a C+ grade. The Saints had a time of possession factor of 23.09 for a D- grade. The Titans had an Omega quarterback rating of 3.9 for an F grade. The Broncos had an Omega quarterback rating of 6.24 for a D grade. The Broncos had the better YPA. The Titans had an inertia rating of 0.90 for an F grade. The Broncos had an inertia rating of 1.85 for a D+ grade. The Titans had an intensity of 0.59 for a D- grade. The Broncos had an intensity of 1.04 for a C- grade. The Titans had a drive factor of 2.00 for a C+ grade. The Broncos had a drive factor of 3.33 for a B+ grade. The Titans had a point factor of 1.38 for a D grade. The Broncos had a point factor of 2.92 for a C+ grade. The Titans had a time of possession factor of 22.54 for a D- grade. The Broncos had a time of possession factor of 42.75 for a C+ grade. Thank you for watching.